Now, Helen has dedicated her career and worked to improve human rights and to end discrimination. As the ACT Human Rights Commissioner for more than a decade and the Discrimination Commissioner for more than a decade, Helen has supervised the handling of more than 1,000 discrimination, vilification and sexual harassment complaints. The ACT community has benefited from Helen's advocacy with better anti-terrorism, discrimination, mental health, guardianship, tenancy and criminal legislation. Helen has audited detention centres for human rights abuses, driven debate to increase transparency and accountability of government, and pioneered community education campaigns. As an expert on HIV and AIDS issues, her advice has been called on by the United Nations. Helen is driven to ensure Australia's legal system is compatible with human rights, and I hope that you can give her a warm welcome as she comes up front now.
Thanks so much, Leanne, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you. That better? Yes. Yep. Okay. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respect to their continuing culture, the oldest in the world at about 40,000 years, and the contribution they make to the life of this Canberra City and ACT region. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Sorry, louder? Yeah, sure. Okay. Mohammed, in inviting me to speak tonight, had a few basic questions which I thought it might be useful to give background. So, first one was, who is a refugee? The answer is in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and 1967 Protocol. A refugee is a person who has a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. So that's settled in international law. There's not much debate about that. That's been modernised over time. I used to sit on the Determination of Refugee Status Committee in the 1980s, and I remember gay men were then recognised as a particular social group. So over time it's kept up with practical common sense categories. There's no legal obligation to resettle refugees, but under Article 33, they must not be returned to countries, the principle is called non-refoulement, where their lives or freedoms will be threatened, such as torture. It would also be a breach of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention Against Torture if those people are sent back to places where they're not going to be free. There's no requirement under the UN Declaration of Human Rights to enter a country legally, and under Article 31 of the Refugee Convention explicitly says it prohibits countries from imposing penalties on people entering illegally, that is, without valid travel documents. Unfortunately, in Australia, we call the people unauthorised arrivals, and since 1992 have subjected them to mandatory detention. It's a policy of both main political parties. An asylum seeker is someone seeking international protection, but their claim for refugee status has not yet been determined. On the other hand, economic migrants seem to be people who are looking for a better life by improving their future prospects, but they don't have that danger of their liberty or their lives being in danger. In Australia, we've resettled over 800,000 refugees since World War II, about 20,000 before that date even. Of those 820,000 people, 738,000 were offshore arrivals, and about 65,000 of them were asylum seekers. So the balance has always been many more offshore people than people who come onshore that get refugee or humanitarian status. Annually, the practice has been to give about 13,750 places to refugees and other humanitarian entrants under the Planned Humanitarian Program. Only in 2012 and 13, when there were over 20,000 asylum seekers, did onshore proportion get close anywhere to the number of people who came from offshore. In that year also, the total grant was actually increased to 20,000 humanitarian entrants, given the large number of asylum seekers. 12,000 of those were refugees and 7,500 were onshore and 12,515 were offshore. To get the global picture, we're just a tiny tip of the iceberg, a drop in the ocean of the need for protecting refugees. At the end of 2013, there were 51 million displaced persons, with 16.7 million refugees, 11.7 million of them formally recognised by UNHCR. We may think we have a lot of asylum claims. The most recent was 24,300, but in Europe they get 484,600. Germany was actually the highest at 109,600. USA, 60,100. We do accept quotas under a formal UNHCR program. There's only 3 countries that do that at any high level, and that is America takes 66,000, we take 13,000, but as I said, we've upped that to 20, and Canada third at 12,000. In terms of countries accepting refugees, the largest number are in the country of Turkey. That is 1.84 million refugees last year. Pakistan close behind at 1.5 million. Lebanon 1.2 million. Iran 982,000. And we come 50th in the world with 35,582. As you know, nationally, we've agreed to take an extra 12,000 Syrian and Iraqi refugees, 250 in Canberra. So far, I understand from the media that only 30 have been resettled, whereas on the other hand, Canada actually flew in 200,000 of their 225,000 Syrian and Iraqi refugees that actually arrived in Canada and are being settled as we speak. What happens in Australia is we prevent boats from landing by turning them around to international waters or detaining them on Christmas Island before transferring them to be processed at Nauru or Manus Island or returned to their country of origin. The majority of people who rode by boat are actually found to be refugees. For example, people coming onshore, Afghanistan has an acceptance rate of 96 to 100% as being real refugees. Whereas on the other hand, people travelling by air will have a much lower proportion of being genuine refugees. The desperation is what sends people in boats to our shores. The average rate of people arriving on shore to be found refugees is about 88%, whereas people coming by air is about 48%, so nearly double. With the Operation Sovereign Borders, since 2014 there's only been 1 boat arrival, but there have been 25 boats carrying 698 people, including 2 boats this year, that have been turned back since that operation started in September 2013. Is the Australian government doing enough? No, I don't think so. We should be accepting more people. We should not be processing people offshore. The third country regime, the Pacific solution from 2001, I think is inhumane. The conditions are not good, and reviewed rights are largely excluded, and we shouldn't be arbitrarily holding people indefinitely. Today, the Supreme Court of Papua New Guinea actually agreed. Under their constitution, section 42, they've declared immigration as unlawful. That means the Australian government and the PNG government will have to take all the people off Manus Island who are being forcibly held. That's a huge development in international law. I did radio on this afternoon, and a local 2CC guy said, how can this be? And I said, well, actually PNG's got a better constitution than Australia. 1975 it was drafted, and you actually have a right not to be arbitrarily detained. We have a pretty terrible and old constitution, and even recently we've had a High Court decision saying it's fine to have people processed offshore. Well, that's maybe under our local constitutional law, but internationally we're acting illegally, and morally we're acting illegally. So those 850 men who are now on Manus Island, I hope to be let free in the next little while. Certainly they've got serious legal claims against the government for the damage they've been caused. One person's been killed, another person, I don't know if you saw Four Corners last night, he had a wound, became septic, and he died in our care, in our lack of care, to be honest. The issue is squarely in the jurisdiction of the Australian Human Rights Commission, and you've probably seen media where Gillian Triggs has been attacked for her work, The Forgotten Children, in 2014, when there are about 2,000 children in detention. A similar situation happened in 2004 by her predecessor, Severdowski, found in 2000 there were 1,923 children in detention. Currently, we're told there are no children in detention, and that's happened because 65 children have been reclassified. However, they're still at Villawood, just that section's been called a different name. Australia's human rights obligations under the treaty we've voluntarily signed up to, we have to apply those standards in areas where we have effective control. And these offshore processing places, we have contracts, agreements with those countries. We definitely have effective control, and human rights law still applies there. In the ACT, I gather we've, over the last 60 years, had 785 people in refugee and humanitarian categories. We don't have asylum seeker detention facilities. I think we're the only jurisdiction that doesn't. But we do have 4 people living in the community in detention, and including 2 children as at 29 February this year. So we do have people not in terrible facilities. They're here in the ACT with some freedom. In terms of the Human Rights Commission mandate in the ACT, we looked at an issue that was brought to us by refugee advocates about the right to education. They were concerned that refugee and asylum seekers were being charged school fees. It took us a 2-year investigation. We worked closely with the Department of Education and Training, and we found that there was a lack of communications between students, families and school, and some families had in fact been charged about $10,000 a year for children's school fees. Working with them, we made sure there was a simplified, clearer system. If you provided an access card to prove that you were an asylum seeker, automatically you would not pay school fees. The problem with the system was the government wanted to keep charging school fees for people who were migrants here specifically for education purposes. That is, they've received marking material and they came to Australia just for the purpose of being a student. So that still applies, but with our look at that situation, now they can actually look at issues like hardship. It's not automatically that they have to pay fees. But asylum seekers and refugees absolutely do not pay fees. We actually have a new right to education that came into force on the 26th of February this year under the Human Rights Act for a right to education. And if that issue came before me again, we could argue it even more strongly. Canberra is an inclusive, compassionate and harmonious community with a proud human rights culture. Late last year, on International Day of Tolerance, we launched a new social media strategy called Diversity Goes With Our Territory. It was straight after the Beirut and Paris bombings, and it was actually felt good we had something positive to contribute, that we weren't going to ask for stronger laws or more law and order. We wanted a positive reaction. So it's to try and stop racism and religious prejudice, which are not common, but we can't be complacent about this occurring. So what we've done is appointed 12 champions, and there will be more in the future. I've got postcards on the table there of 2 people you may already know, Bianca Elmir and Francis Owusu. Some of the other champions are Muhammad Ali himself, Rod Little, Karen Middleton and David Morrison. We included David Morrison because it's important that majority leaders will stand together with people from minority communities to show that we have the same values and people should not be treated differently. The research about racists is that they're not likely to appeal if we have everyone from minority groups. They actually identify with mainstream community leaders, and we can shame them into not being racist by being influenced by that mainstream opinion. We hope to, when we started the campaign, it was to try and show the heart of Canberra, a place for us and our children to live in trust and hope, not fear and hate as terrorists would have us. And Mohammed, in the Chronicle front page at the weekend of the Multicultural Festival, actually said we'd capture the soul of Canberra, which is far beyond what we wanted to do, but if it does, I think that's fantastic. It will be rolled out more. We have a new Human Rights Commission that started on the 1st of April. We've nearly tripled in size, combining with the Victims of Crime Commission. You may be seeing it on car number plates. Diversity goes with our territory. But I think where it's really important is we're doing a pilot consultation with an ACT school about countering violent extremism. We don't want kids groomed and targeted by violent terrorists. We want them to feel that they belong in the community, and you have to listen to those children who may be alienated and isolated, and not to make that worse, to actually make it better. And this diversity goes with our territory as part of that campaign. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Helen. It's amazing to hear the number of refugees that are drifting around the world and the small numbers that Australia is accepting. But it's also great to hear about the positive approach that we've got here in Canberra and sort of this ability to assign champions and bring this diversity and this need for diversity into the mainstream. So our